We discovered our daughter was switched at birth, and when we tried to meet her, we found out something even worse. Our daughter Sophie needed routine blood work before a minor surgery when she was 10 years old. The doctor called us into his office and said there was a problem with the results. Her blood type was O negative, but my husband and I are both A positive, which he said was genetically impossible. We did a DNA test and Sophie wasn't biologically related to either of us. The hospital admitted there must have been a switch and gave us contact information for the other family. Our biological daughter's name was Anna. That night I watched Sophie sleep and couldn't stop crying because I loved her just as much as before. My husband and I decided not to tell her yet because we didn't want to scare her. We needed to find Anna. I called the other family and a woman answered. "Hi, I think there's been a terrible mistake at the hospital where our daughters were born," I said. There was a long silence. "We need time to process this," she finally said. "I'll call you back." A week went by with no call. I kept imagining both girls in our lives, picturing them becoming best friends and celebrating birthdays together. I wasn't trying to replace Sophie or take Anna away from her family. I just wanted to know my biological daughter. I called again. "I know this is overwhelming, but we just want to meet Anna. We can figure everything else out together." She sighed. "We're still thinking about how to handle this. We need more time." I asked what there was to think about because Anna was my daughter. She said it was complicated. Another 2 weeks passed and I called every few days. "Now isn't a good time," she kept saying. "We're dealing with some family stuff and Anna is going through a lot right now." I asked if Anna was okay. "I can't get into it right now, but we'll reach out when things calm down." Sophie asked me one morning why I seemed sad, and I told her everything was fine. My husband grabbed the phone from me one day when I was crying. "Listen, we have every right to meet our daughter and we're not going to wait forever," he said firmly. She got defensive. "You need to think about what's best for Anna and not just yourselves. This is complicated and you're making it harder." I took the phone back. "Please, we've missed 10 years of her life already." She said the timing wasn't right and hung up. Sophie asked why I kept crying and I hugged her tight and told her I loved her more than anything. Another month went by with emails and texts begging them to reconsider. I left a voicemail saying we were coming to their house whether they liked it or not. She texted back saying fine, they'd meet us at a diner, but they needed to talk to us alone first. I asked my sister to watch Sophie. We showed up at the diner and the other couple was already sitting at a table in the back. The woman's eyes were red and puffy and the man looked like he hadn't slept in days. We sat down and I immediately said, "Where is Anna? When can we meet her?" The woman looked at her husband and he stared down at the table. "There's something we need to tell you first," he said quietly. My husband leaned forward. "What's going on? Why all the secrecy?" The man took a deep breath. "This has been the hardest 2 years of our lives." I felt my chest tighten. "What do you mean 2 years?" The woman started crying harder. "We should have called you right away when we found out about the switch. But we were scared and didn't know what to do." My husband's voice got louder. "Found out about the switch? When did you find out?" The man said, 2 years ago, when our daughter needed blood work, same as yours. That's when we realized Anna wasn't biologically ours." I couldn't believe it. "You've known for 2 years and didn't tell us?" The woman was sobbing. "We were going to tell you. We wanted to. But then everything happened and we just couldn't deal with it." I was getting angrier. "I don't care about your excuses. Where is Anna right now?" The man looked at his wife and then back at us. "She's not here. You can't see her." My husband stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly. "Then take us to her. Right now, or we're calling the police." The couple looked at each other and something passed between them that made my blood run cold. "We can't do that," the woman whispered through her tears. I felt my own tears starting. "Why not? What happened? Is she okay?" The man's voice broke when he said, "Anna died 2 years ago. We left her in the car on a hot day. We forgot she was there." I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. My husband made a sound like he'd been punched. The man looked right at me. "We were so afraid to tell you this. But then we realized that avoiding you wasn't the right decision. Because you're going to give us Sophie back. We're getting a second chance." I can't breathe, and the room tilts sideways while my husband's chair scrapes back. He lunges across the table at Edward and I grab his arm hard enough that my nails dig into his skin. Edward jerks backward and Kira flinches so hard she almost falls off her chair. My mind keeps screaming the same words over and over. Our daughter died 2 years ago and we never knew she existed. My husband's voice comes out strangled and broken when he says we're calling the police right now. His phone is already in his hand and shaking. Edward holds up both hands like he's trying to calm down a wild animal. He says please just listen for 1 minute because they know what they did was unforgivable, but they're trying to make it right. I'm shaking so hard I can barely hold my own phone, and I hear myself asking how giving them Sophie makes anything right when they killed our daughter. The words feel like they're coming from someone else's mouth. Kira wails that it was an accident and they've been living in hell ever since Anna died. She's sobbing so hard she can barely get the words out. My husband tells them they're completely insane if they think any court would give them custody after what they did to Anna. His voice is getting louder and people at other tables are starting to stare at us. Edward says they've already talked to attorneys who told them biological parents have rights, and their mistake doesn't erase the fact that Sophie is legally theirs. I feel like I'm going to throw up right there on the table. I realize they're actually serious about this, and they've been planning it. I stand up so fast my chair tips backward and hits the floor. I tell them we're leaving right now, and if they come anywhere near Sophie, we'll get a restraining order. Kira grabs my wrist across the table, and her fingers are cold and wet from crying. She begs me to understand they just want their daughter back, and they deserve a second chance after everything they've been through. My husband pulls me away from her, and we rush toward the exit while other customers stare at us. I can hear Kira still crying behind us, and Edward calling out that we'll be hearing from their attorney. We make it to our car in the parking lot, and I'm hyperventilating so bad I can't get my seatbelt on. My hands won't stop shaking, and I keep seeing Anna's face even though I never met her. My husband is on his phone calling his brother who works as a paralegal at a law firm downtown. I can hear him trying to explain what just happened, but his voice keeps breaking. He's asking what our legal position is and whether the Lanes can actually do this. His brother must be talking for a long time because my husband just sits there listening with his jaw getting tighter. Finally, he says okay and thank you and hangs up. He tells me his brother says we need a family law attorney immediately because biological parent claims are really complicated. I call my sister Sabine and barely get 3 words out before I'm sobbing too hard to talk. She asks what's wrong and where am I and is Sophie okay. I manage to tell her Sophie's fine, but we need help right now. Sabine says she's coming to our house right now and she'll stay as long as we need her. She says Sophie can't see us like this, and we need to figure out what to do next. My husband is staring straight ahead through the windshield with his jaw clenched, so tight I can see the muscles jumping. I know he's imagining our biological daughter dying alone in a hot car while those people forgot about her. We drive home, and neither of us says a single word because there's nothing to say that makes any sense. When we pull into our driveway, I see Sophie's bike lying on the front lawn where she left it this morning. I realize we have to go inside and pretend everything is fine and normal. My husband squeezes my hand and says we're not giving her up no matter what it takes. Sabine's car pulls up 30 minutes later, and she finds us sitting at the kitchen table just staring at nothing. Sophie is upstairs doing her homework and singing along to music. She has no idea her whole world is about to explode into pieces. Sabine hugs us both and asks what happened at the meeting. We tell her everything while she sits there with her hand over her mouth. She says she'll take Sophie to her place for a sleepover tonight so we can figure out our next steps. Sophie comes downstairs excited about an unexpected sleepover with her aunt and doesn't notice our red eyes. After they leave, I finally break down completely on the kitchen floor. My husband sits down next to me and holds me while I sob for the daughter we never got to meet and the daughter we might lose. He says we're going to fight this with everything we have and the Lanes will never get near Sophie. We spend the entire night at the computer researching family law and custody rights until our eyes blur and burn. Everything we read makes us more scared because biological parents really do have legal standing, even when other parents raise the child their whole life. The hospital switch creates this weird, unique situation that could go either way depending on what judge we get. I find cases where biological parents won custody years later, and cases where they lost. There's no clear answer, and that makes it worse somehow. At 3 a.m, I find myself sitting on the floor of Sophie's room with her baby album spread across my lap. The pages are filled with photos of her first smile and first steps and birthday parties where she blew out candles on cakes I baked. I'm crying so hard I can barely see the pictures anymore. My husband finds me there and sits down next to me without saying anything at first. He puts his arm around my shoulders and pulls me close. Finally, he says she's ours no matter what any DNA test says, because we're her real parents in every way that matters. I know he's right, but I can't stop thinking about what a judge might decide. Courts care about biology and blood, and the Lanes have that on their side. My husband takes the album from my hands and closes it gently. He tells me we need to get some sleep because we have the lawyer meeting in the morning. I follow him back to our bedroom, but I don't sleep at all. The next morning, we meet with Lysandra Odom at her office downtown. The building is old with creaky floors, and her office smells like coffee and paper. She's maybe 50 years old with gray hair pulled back in a bun and sharp eyes that watch us carefully while we talk. My husband's brother recommended her because she handles complicated family law cases. We sit across from her desk and I try to explain everything that happened, but I keep losing track of what I'm saying. My husband takes over and tells her about the hospital switch and finding out 2 years too late, and the Lanes admitting they killed Anna. Lysandra listens without interrupting and takes notes on a yellow legal pad. When we finish, she sits back in her chair and says, "This is one of the most complicated cases she's ever encountered." The problem is we have biological rights versus established parenting, and that creates a genuine legal mess that could go either way. Lysandra starts explaining how family courts work, and I try to focus on her words. She says courts are supposed to prioritize the child's best interests above everything else, including parent rights. That should work in our favor because Sophie has only ever known us as her parents. But then she warns us that biological connection carries serious weight in custody decisions. The Lanes could argue for a gradual custody transition, where Sophie slowly moves from our home to theirs over months or even years. I feel sick hearing her describe these scenarios where my daughter gets forced to live with strangers who killed their last child. My husband reaches over and grabs my hand so hard it hurts. Lysandra keeps talking about psychological evaluations and home studies and guardian ad litem appointments. She says we need to prepare for a real fight because the Lanes aren't going to just give up. My husband leans forward and asks the question that's been burning in my mind since yesterday. He wants to know if the Lanes killing Anna disqualifies them as parents to any child. Lysandra shakes her head slowly and says it's not that simple. We would need to prove criminal negligence in Anna's death, and even then it might not prevent them from claiming custody of a different child. She explains that family courts and criminal courts are separate systems with different standards. The Lanes were never charged with any crime, so legally they're considered fit parents despite what happened. Lysandra recommends we immediately file for legal custody confirmation and prepare for a long battle. She says she can file emergency motions to prevent the Lanes from contacting Sophie while we build our case. Someone knocks on the office door and a man walks in carrying 2 cups of coffee. Lysandra introduces him as her husband, Roland, who handles criminal defense work. She asked him to join us because he might be able to identify potential charges against the Lanes. Roland sits down and listens while Lysandra summarizes what we told her. He nods and says leaving a child in a car that results in death is usually charged as vehicular manslaughter or negligent homicide. But he points out that 2 years have already passed since Anna died. The statute of limitations and the lack of any police investigation back then creates big problems for prosecution now. He asks if we know how the death was officially recorded, and we admit we have no idea. I ask why the Lanes weren't charged when Anna died if what they did was a crime. Roland explains they probably told doctors and police it was sudden infant death syndrome or some other medical cause. Without an autopsy or proper investigation, the death certificate would just show natural causes. He says parents lie about these situations all the time because they're terrified of losing their other children or going to prison. The Lanes essentially got away with killing our daughter through their negligence because nobody asked the right questions 2 years ago. My husband's face goes red and he asks if there's any way to charge them now. Roland says it's possible but difficult because evidence degrades over time and witnesses forget details. He promises to look into it and see what options exist. We spend another hour going over legal strategy and filling out paperwork. Lysandra explains her retainer fee, and I watch our savings account balance drop to almost nothing when my husband signs the check. She promises to file emergency motions today to prevent the Lanes from contacting Sophie while we build our case. My husband asks how long this whole process will take from start to finish. Lysandra looks at us with sympathy and says custody battles can last months or even years depending on how hard both sides fight. She warns us to prepare for a marathon, not a sprint. We need to document everything about Sophie's life with us, and gather character witnesses and prepare for home inspections. The Lanes will be doing the same thing to prove they deserve custody. 3 days later, I'm making lunch for Sophie when my phone rings with Lysandra's number. My hands start shaking before I even answer. She tells me the Lanes have hired their own attorney who just sent over a formal demand letter. They're claiming biological parent rights and requesting supervised visitation with Sophie as a first step toward shared custody. I have to sit down because my legs won't hold me up anymore. I ask Lysandra if they can actually force us to let them see her. She says not yet, but their attorney is threatening to file for emergency custody if we don't cooperate with gradual introduction. Lysandra already filed our counter-motion arguing that Sophie's psychological well-being requires stability with her established family. A judge will decide which argument wins at a hearing scheduled for next week. That night after Sophie goes to bed, my husband and I argue in whispers in our bedroom. He thinks we should tell Sophie what's happening before the court hearing so she's prepared. I'm terrified of traumatizing her with information she's way too young to process. She's only 10 years old, and how do you explain to a child that strangers want to take her away because of biology? My husband says she'll find out eventually, and it's better coming from us than from a judge or social worker. I start crying again because I know he's right, but I can't stand the thought of seeing fear in her eyes. We go back and forth for over an hour until we finally compromise. We'll tell her we're dealing with some legal paperwork about her birth, but everything is fine and she's safe with us. It's not the whole truth, but maybe it's enough for now. The next morning, Sophie comes downstairs for breakfast and sits at the table pushing her cereal around with her spoon. She looks at me with this worried expression and asks if all this legal stuff is about her blood type being different from ours. My stomach drops because I realize she's been thinking about that doctor's visit for weeks now and connecting dots we didn't want her to connect yet. I sit down next to her and take her hand and tell her the hospital made a mistake when she was born, but it doesn't change anything about our family. She nods slowly and says, okay, but I can see in her eyes she knows we're not telling her everything. She asks if everything is really fine, and I promise her it will be and give her a hug that lasts way too long. My husband watches from the doorway, and I know we're both thinking the same thing, that we can't keep this secret much longer. The week drags by with Sophie asking fewer questions but watching us more carefully. The night before the hearing, I can't sleep at all and end up on the couch with my laptop at 2 a.m. I search for switched at birth custody cases and find dozens of stories about families discovering hospital mistakes years later. Most of them worked out some kind of shared custody arrangement or gradual transition that let both families stay involved in the kids' lives. The parents in those cases talked about honoring both the biological connection and the bonds formed through years of raising a child. But none of those cases involved one child dying because her parents forgot her in a hot car. None of them had parents trying to replace a dead daughter with the living one they never knew. I close my laptop and stare at the dark living room and wonder how we ended up in a situation with no good examples to follow. At the courthouse the next morning, my hands shake so badly I can barely sign in at the security desk. We meet Lysandra in the hallway outside the courtroom, and she goes over what to expect one more time. Then I see the Lanes walking toward us from the other end of the hall, and Kira looks worse than she did at the diner. Her face is pale and thin, and she has dark circles under her eyes like she hasn't slept in weeks. Edward walks next to her with his hand on her back, and they both avoid looking at us. We all file into the courtroom and sit on opposite sides like we're enemies instead of two families caught in the same nightmare. The judge comes in, and she's this stern-looking woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back tight. She tells everyone to sit and starts reading through the case file while we all wait in silence. Lysandra stands up when the judge asks her to present our position. She talks about Sophie's stable home life with us, and how we've been her parents for 10 years, and how ripping her away from the only family she knows would traumatize her. Then she brings up the Lanes' history and says they were criminally negligent with Anna, and that history shows they're not fit to parent any child. The Lanes' attorney objects and says that's prejudicial and irrelevant to Sophie's custody. He argues that biological parents have fundamental rights, and the Lanes have shown remorse and gone through therapy. The judge listens to both sides without showing any reaction on her face. When the attorneys finish, she looks at all of us and says, "This is clearly a complicated situation that requires careful evaluation before any custody decisions are made." The judge orders a full custody evaluation that will include home studies of both families and psychological assessments of everyone involved, and interviews with Sophie. She says a court-appointed evaluator will spend the next 6 to 8 weeks gathering information to help determine what's truly in Sophie's best interest. Then she grants a temporary order that keeps Sophie with us during the evaluation, but requires us to cooperate fully with all the evaluation requirements. The Lanes' attorney stands up and asks about visitation rights during this time. The judge shakes her head and says no visitation until the evaluation is complete, and she's reviewed the findings. Kira makes this quiet sobbing sound, and Edward puts his arm around her shoulders. The judge bangs her gavel and says court is adjourned, and everyone starts gathering their things. Outside the courtroom, Lysandra explains that the custody evaluation will take 6 to 8 weeks, and the evaluator's report will basically determine what the judge decides. She says a psychologist named Marcella Price has been appointed to do the evaluation, and she'll contact us within a few days to schedule interviews and home visits. I ask if we have to tell Sophie the truth now, and Lysandra says the psychologist will almost certainly require it, because she needs to interview Sophie, and kids can tell when adults are hiding things. My husband asks how we're supposed to explain this to a 10-year-old, and Lysandra says Marcella will help us figure out the right way to do it. We drive home in silence, and I keep thinking about Sophie's face when we tell her that strangers want to take her away from us. 3 days later, we're sitting in Marcella Price's office, and she's nothing like I expected. She's warm and soft-spoken with kind eyes, and she starts by saying she knows how hard this situation is for everyone. She explains that her job is to understand Sophie's emotional needs and family bonds, and figure out what arrangement would be best for her development and happiness. She's not here to judge anyone or take sides, but to advocate for what Sophie needs. Then she says something that makes my chest tight. She tells us Sophie will need to know the truth about the hospital switch before Marcella can interview her properly, because children are incredibly perceptive, and they sense when adults are lying to them. If Sophie doesn't know what's happening, she won't be able to give honest answers about how she feels. I start crying, and Marcella hands me a tissue and says she'll help us plan how to tell Sophie in a way that won't traumatize her more than necessary. Marcella spends the next hour helping us figure out what to say and how to say it. She recommends we focus on the hospital mistake and emphasize how much we love Sophie while avoiding details about Anna's death at first. She says we should let Sophie ask questions and answer them honestly, but in age-appropriate ways. My husband and I practice the conversation over and over in her office until we can get through it without completely breaking down. Marcella schedules a time for us to tell Sophie on Saturday morning at our house, and she'll be there to provide support and help Sophie process her feelings. We drive home, and I feel sick knowing we have 3 days until we have to tell our daughter that her whole world is about to change. Saturday morning comes too fast, and Marcella arrives at our house at 10. Sophie is confused about why this nice lady is here and why we're all sitting in the living room instead of watching cartoons. I take Sophie's hands in mine and tell her we need to talk about something important. My voice shakes when I explain that the hospital made a big mistake when she was born and accidentally switched her with another baby. I say that means we're not biologically related, but that doesn't change anything about how much we love her or that we're her real parents. Sophie's face goes through this awful progression of confusion, and then disbelief, and then pure fear. She pulls her hands away and asks if this means we're not her real mom and dad. Her voice gets high and panicky, and I can see her trying to process what this means for her life. My husband reaches over and pulls Sophie into his lap and holds her tight. He tells her we are absolutely her real parents, because we've loved her and taken care of her for 10 years, and that's what makes a family. Sophie starts crying and asks about her biological parents and whether they want her back. I force myself to stay calm and tell her they would like to meet her someday, but right now all the adults are trying to figure out what's best for everyone. I don't tell her about the custody battle or the court hearings or the fact that they want to take her away from us. Marcella sits forward in her chair and asks Sophie in this gentle voice what she's feeling right now. Sophie says she's scared and confused, and she doesn't understand why this is happening. Sophie looks at me with tears running down her face and asks if she has to leave us and go live with these other people. I grab her hand and promise her that will never happen, and we're fighting to keep our family together no matter what. She asks if we promise, and I say yes, even though I know I can't actually promise that because it's up to a judge. Marcella asks Sophie how she feels about having biological parents she's never met, and Sophie says she doesn't want to meet them because we're her family, and she's scared everything is going to change. She asks why they want her if they didn't even raise her, and I don't have a good answer for that. Marcella tells Sophie it's okay to feel scared and confused and angry, and that all those feelings are normal. She says they're going to talk more in the coming weeks, and Sophie can ask any questions she wants. Sophie just cries harder and buries her face in my husband's chest, while I sit there feeling like the worst mother in the world for putting her through this. The next few days were awful because Sophie wouldn't let me out of her sight for more than a few minutes. She followed me from room to room and kept asking if we were still her real parents and if anyone could take her away from us. I told her over and over that we were her parents forever and nothing would change that, but I could see she didn't fully believe me. She started having nightmares and would wake up crying in the middle of the night asking if we were still there. My husband and I took turns sleeping in her room on the floor just so she'd feel safe enough to fall asleep. She barely touched her food at dinner, and her teacher called to say she seemed distracted and anxious at the school. Marcella came to our house twice that week to talk with Sophie alone in her bedroom, while my husband and I waited downstairs feeling helpless. After the second visit, Marcella told us Sophie was showing signs of anticipated grief, which meant she was already mourning the potential loss of us, even though nothing had happened yet. She said this was a normal response to feeling like her whole world might disappear, and we needed to keep reassuring her while also being honest about the situation. I asked how we could be honest without terrifying her more, and Marcella said we should focus on what we were doing to keep the family together, rather than all the ways it could fall apart. My husband called Lysandra the next day and asked if there was anything else we could do to strengthen our case. Lysandra said we should hire a private investigator to dig into the Lane's background and find anything that might show they weren't fit to parent anyone. My husband agreed immediately and asked who she recommended. She gave us the name Duncan Reese and said he was a former police detective who specialized in family law cases and knew how to find information that could make or break custody battles. We called Duncan that afternoon, and he came to our house the same evening. He was a big guy in his 50s with gray hair and this calm way of talking that made me feel like he'd seen everything before. He sat at our kitchen table with a notebook and asked us to tell him everything we knew about the Lanes. We explained about Anna's death and how they'd hidden it for 2 years, and now wanted Sophie as a replacement. Duncan wrote everything down and said he'd look into their employment history, financial stability, criminal records, and what their neighbors thought of them. He said people always left trails of who they really were, and he was good at finding those trails. My husband asked how long it would take, and Duncan said he'd have preliminary findings in about 2 weeks. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The waiting was terrible because every day felt like the Lanes might show up and try to take Sophie, or the court might suddenly rule in their favor. Sophie kept asking why we seemed worried, and I tried to act normal, but she could tell something was wrong. I took her to the park and made her favorite meals and helped with her homework like everything was fine. But inside, I was counting down the days until Duncan called. 2 weeks later, my phone rang while I was making breakfast, and Duncan asked if we could meet at Lysandra's office that afternoon. My stomach dropped because I couldn't tell from his voice if he'd found good news or bad news. We got a babysitter for Sophie and drove to Lysandra's office building downtown. Duncan was already there when we arrived, and he had a thick file folder on the conference table. Lysandra closed the door, and we all sat down while Duncan opened the folder and spread out papers in front of us. He said the Lanes were even more unstable than we'd thought, and he'd found evidence that would seriously hurt their custody claim. He showed us documents proving they'd moved 3 times in the past 2 years, each time leaving suddenly without much notice to landlords or neighbors. Kira had been hospitalized twice for psychiatric emergencies according to the hospital records he'd obtained through his contacts. Edward had lost his job 6 months ago after multiple warnings about missing work and erratic behavior. They were currently 3 months behind on rent and facing eviction from their current house. My husband leaned forward and asked if this meant they couldn't get custody, and Lysandra said it helped our case significantly, but we needed more. Duncan pulled out another stack of papers and said this was where it got really interesting. He'd managed to get copies of Kira's medical records from her psychiatrist through a legal loophole involving the custody case. The records showed she'd been prescribed antipsychotic medication after Anna's death to treat severe depression and delusions. Her psychiatrist's notes described how Kira would talk about Anna as if she were still alive and insisted she could hear her daughter calling for her. The medication had helped for a while, but Kira stopped taking it about a year ago against medical advice. Her psychiatrist had tried to convince her to resume treatment, but Kira refused and stopped attending therapy sessions. Duncan said this explained why Kira seemed so desperate to get Sophie because in her mind, she was getting Anna back. Edward's employment records showed he'd been fired for screaming at coworkers and leaving work in the middle of shifts without explanation. His former boss had noted in his file that Edward seemed to be having some kind of breakdown and recommended he seek professional help. I felt sick reading all this because these were the people who wanted to raise our daughter. Lysandra said this evidence was exactly what we needed to show the Lanes were unfit to parent anyone, especially a child they'd never met who was already traumatized by this situation. But she warned us that grief-related mental illness might actually make the judge feel sympathetic toward them rather than disqualifying them as parents. Some judges believed that taking away parental rights because of mental health issues was discriminatory, unless we could prove their instability posed actual danger to Sophie. My husband got frustrated and said wasn't it obvious they were dangerous if Kira was delusional, and Edward was having violent outbursts. Lysandra said we needed to document specific incidents that showed they couldn't provide a safe environment, not just general instability. Duncan said he wasn't finished yet and pulled out more papers. He'd interviewed the Lanes' current neighbors, and 3 different people had filed complaints with CPS in the past year. The reports described Kira standing in her yard talking to an imaginary child and setting out toys for no one. One neighbor had seen her having a full conversation with empty air and calling out Anna's name. Another neighbor reported that Edward had screaming fits in the middle of the night and had threatened to fight another neighbor over a parking space. CPS had conducted welfare checks after each report, but closed the cases because there was no child in the home to be in danger. Duncan said the CPS reports were critical because they showed a pattern of concerning behavior witnessed by multiple independent sources. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcella finished her evaluation and called us in for a meeting to discuss her findings. We sat in her office while she reviewed her notes and said Sophie was a well-adjusted child with normal development for her age. Sophie had strong attachment to us and felt secure in our home and family structure. When Marcella asked Sophie about meeting the Lanes, Sophie had expressed clear preference to stay with us and significant anxiety about the idea of living with strangers. Marcella said her report would recommend maintaining the current custody arrangement because removing Sophie from our home would cause serious psychological harm. I felt relief wash over me, but then Marcella said there was more we needed to discuss. She said the Lanes' grief over Anna's death was clearly genuine, and their desire for connection to Sophie came from unresolved trauma rather than malicious intent. Kira was struggling with complicated grief that had turned into delusion, and Edward was dealing with guilt and depression that manifested as anger. Marcella had recommended in her report that the Lanes undergo intensive therapy before any contact with Sophie could be considered. Their attorney had agreed to the therapy requirement, but was still pushing for eventual visitation rights once the Lanes were more stable. My husband asked if that meant the judge might order us to let them see Sophie someday, and Marcella said it was possible depending on how the Lanes responded to treatment. 4 weeks into the whole evaluation process, Lysandra called and said the Lanes' attorney had requested a mediation session to discuss possible compromise solutions. Lysandra sounded skeptical and said mediation often failed in cases this emotionally charged, but it might reveal the Lanes' true intentions and could actually strengthen our case if they said the wrong things. We agreed to meet with a court-appointed mediator present to keep things from getting out of control. Meanwhile, Sophie had started asking more questions about her biological parents and what kind of people they were. I didn't want to poison her against them because that could backfire in court, but I also didn't want to lie and make them sound better than they were. I told her they were going through really hard times and dealing with their own sadness about losing someone they loved. Sophie asked if that meant they were nice people, and I said I thought they were probably good people who had something really bad happen and were having trouble dealing with it. Sophie was quiet for a minute and then said she felt bad for them, but she didn't want to live with sad people who were strangers to her. She asked if feeling bad for them meant she had to go live with them, and I promised her that feeling sorry for someone didn't mean you had to give up your whole life for them. The mediation session was scheduled for the following week at a neutral office building downtown. Lysandra told us to stay calm and let her do most of the talking. My husband and I drove there in silence because we both knew this was probably pointless, but we had to try. The conference room had a long table with chairs on both sides, and a mediator already waiting when we arrived. The Lanes showed up 5 minutes later with their attorney. Kira looked different from at the diner, like she was on medication that smoothed out her features and made her movements slow. Edward walked in first and sat down without looking at us. Their attorney was a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who introduced himself and started explaining the mediation process. The mediator was a woman who said her job was to help both families find common ground and reach an agreement that served everyone's interests. I wanted to tell her there was no common ground between us and people who killed our daughter, but Lysandra squeezed my arm under the table. Edward cleared his throat and said they appreciated us coming because this was hard for everyone involved. He said they understood Sophie had lived with us her whole life, and they weren't trying to disrupt her world. Kira nodded along but didn't speak. Edward continued and said they just wanted to be part of Sophie's life as her biological parents. Maybe start with some supervised visits so everyone could get to know each other. Lysandra asked what specific arrangement they had in mind. Edward said maybe once a month at first, just a few hours with a social worker present, and then gradually increased to overnight stays after Sophie got comfortable. He said eventually they hoped to work toward shared custody, where Sophie spent time with both families. My husband's hand slammed on the table and he said absolutely not. Sophie was scared of them and forcing contact would hurt her. Kira started crying quietly and said they just wanted to know their daughter. I felt anger rising in my chest, and I leaned forward and asked them directly why they thought they deserved any access to Sophie after killing Anna through their carelessness. The room went completely silent. Edward's face changed and got hard while Kira sobbed louder. Their attorney objected and said Anna's death was a terrible accident that had nothing to do with Sophie's custody situation. The mediator tried to redirect the conversation, but I kept going. I said they left our daughter in a hot car and she died alone and scared, and now they wanted to take the child we raised. Edward's jaw clenched and Kira covered her face with her hands. My husband leaned forward and told them they didn't actually want Sophie. They wanted to replace Anna and make themselves feel better about what they did. Edward stood up so fast his chair scraped across the floor. He shouted that we stole 10 years with his biological daughter while he raised ours. Kira grabbed his arm and begged him to sit down, but he kept yelling. He said we had no idea what they'd been through and we were using Anna's death to keep Sophie from her real parents. The mediator stood up and called for a break before things got worse. Lysandra pulled us out into the hallway while the Lanes went the other direction. She said they just destroyed their own case by showing their real motivation was replacement instead of actual parenting concern. The mediator would report this whole exchange to the judge, and it proved our argument that contact would harm Sophie. My husband asked if we had to go back in there. Lysandra said no, the mediation was clearly over and we should leave. We walked out of the building and I felt shaky, but also relieved that the Lanes had shown their true colors in front of witnesses. 2 days later, Roland called my husband's phone while we were eating dinner. He said he had important news about potential criminal charges against the Lanes. My husband put the phone on speaker, and Roland explained that he'd been investigating Anna's death and found a witness. A neighbor saw Edward leave Anna in the car that day and called the police to report it, but somehow the report never got properly investigated. With this witness willing to testify, the district attorney might reopen the case. I asked if that meant the Lanes could actually be charged with a crime. Roland said yes, possibly negligent homicide or child endangerment, which were serious felonies. He'd already reached out to the DA's office and they were interested in reviewing the evidence. My husband asked how long that would take, and Roland said probably a few weeks for them to investigate and decide whether to file charges. The next morning, Roland met with the district attorney and presented all the evidence he'd gathered about Anna's death. The DA agreed to investigate, but warned that going after a 2-year-old case would be difficult. He said the Lanes' obvious grief might make a jury feel sorry for them instead of wanting to punish them. Still, even the threat of criminal charges might pressure them to drop their custody claim for Sophie. Roland said he'd keep us updated on the DA's decision. 3 days after that, Lysandra called and said the Lanes' attorney had contacted her with an offer. His clients would withdraw their custody petition completely if we agreed not to pursue criminal charges against them. Lysandra told him we didn't control the DA's office, but she'd communicate the offer to us. My husband and I sat at the kitchen table that night trying to decide what we wanted. Part of me wanted to see them prosecuted and held responsible for what they did to Anna. But another part of me just wanted this nightmare to end, so our family could go back to normal. My husband said we owed it to Anna to make sure her death meant something and wasn't just swept under the rug. But we also owed it to Sophie to protect her from months or years of legal trauma while a criminal trial dragged on. I said I didn't know which daughter we were supposed to prioritize when their needs seemed to pull in opposite directions. We went back and forth for hours without reaching a decision. The next day, we met with Marcella at her office, and she could tell something was wrong. She asked how Sophie was doing, and I admitted that Sophie's worry had gotten worse because she could sense our stress. Marcella said that was exactly what she'd been afraid of. She said Sophie's immediate mental health had to be our top priority right now. If the Lanes withdrew their custody claim, Sophie could start healing from all this disruption and fear. But if we pushed for prosecution, the trauma would stretch out for months or maybe years while the case went through the courts. Marcella said she understood our desire for justice, but we had to think about what Sophie needed most. I asked if that meant we should just let the Lanes get away with killing our daughter. Marcella said it wasn't about letting them get away with anything. It was about choosing which path would actually help Sophie versus which path would satisfy our own need for revenge. She said the Lanes would have to live with what they did for the rest of their lives regardless of whether they went to prison. My husband and I left her office feeling even more confused about what the right choice was. That night, my husband and I sat up late trying to decide what we owed to each daughter. I kept thinking about Anna dying alone in that car and how the Lanes never faced any punishment for it, but I also thought about Sophie crying herself to sleep because she could feel our stress. My husband said we should call Roland in the morning and tell him to move forward with supporting the DA's investigation. I agreed because maybe holding the Lanes accountable would help us process what happened to Anna. The next morning, I called Roland and explained our decision. He said he understood and would contact the DA's office right away. I told him we'd support prosecution, but couldn't actively participate if it meant dragging Sophie through months of trauma. Roland said the DA might proceed anyway, based on the witness testimony and evidence of the cover-up. 3 days later, Roland called back and said the DA was filing charges against the Lanes for negligent homicide and child endangerment. The grand jury had reviewed the evidence and issued an indictment. I felt this weird mix of relief and guilt, because part of me wanted them punished, but another part felt sick about it. My husband asked when the trial would happen, and Roland said probably 6 to 8 months because criminal cases take time to prepare. The indictment changed everything in our custody case almost overnight. Lysandra called the same day and said the Lanes' attorney had withdrawn from their custody petition completely. She said no lawyer wants to represent parents facing criminal charges for killing a child while they're simultaneously trying to gain custody of another child. The Lanes had also stopped all attempts to contact us or make demands about Sophie. Lysandra was already preparing paperwork to file for permanent custody confirmation and termination of the Lanes' parental rights based on their criminal conduct. She said judges almost never grant custody to parents facing felony charges related to child welfare. I asked if this meant we'd won, and Lysandra said we still needed the final court order, but yes, we were going to keep Sophie. My husband grabbed my hand across the table and I started crying because the nightmare might actually be ending. Over the next few weeks, I noticed my stress levels dropping, and apparently Sophie noticed too. She came into the kitchen one morning while I was making breakfast and asked if the legal problems were over. I told her we were making really good progress and she was safe with us forever. Sophie looked relieved, but then asked if she'd ever have to meet her biological parents. I sat down with her and said honestly, I didn't know what the future held, but right now she didn't have to worry about it. She asked if they were bad people, and I struggled with how to answer that. I finally said they made some really serious mistakes, and they were dealing with the consequences of those choices. Sophie seemed to accept that, and went back to eating her cereal. Later that day, she asked if she could invite friends over for a sleepover, and I realized she hadn't asked to have friends over in months, because she'd been too anxious. Lysandra called the following week and said the Lanes' criminal trial was scheduled for 6 months away. Our custody hearing would likely wait until after the verdict because the judge wanted to see how the criminal case turned out. If the Lanes were convicted, terminating their parental rights would become almost automatic. If they were somehow acquitted, we'd have to argue their fitness based on all the evidence Duncan had gathered about their mental health and instability. My husband asked what the chances were of them being acquitted, and Lysandra said slim to none given the witness testimony and their own admission during our mediation session. Still, we had to wait for the trial to play out before we could finalize Sophie's custody permanently. I started seeing a grief counselor around this time because I realized I needed help processing everything. The counselor's name was Dr. Sarah Sanchez, and she specialized in complicated grief situations. I told her about Anna dying before I ever knew she existed, and about the Lanes trying to replace her with Sophie. Dr. Sanchez helped me understand that I could grieve for the daughter I never knew while still protecting the daughter I was raising. She said these weren't competing loyalties, but parallel responsibilities that both deserved attention. I went to sessions twice a week at first, and gradually worked through the anger I felt toward the Lanes and the sadness about never getting to meet Anna. Dr. Sanchez said it was normal to feel like I'd failed Anna, even though logically I knew I couldn't have prevented what happened. She helped me separate my grief over Anna's death from my fear about losing Sophie. My husband struggled more with anger and revenge fantasies about the Lanes than I did. He'd lie awake at night imagining confronting them or making them suffer the way Anna suffered. I convinced him to come to counseling sessions with me and Dr. Sanchez worked with both of us on processing his rage. She explained that revenge fantasies were normal, but acting on them would only hurt our family and give the Lanes more power over our lives. My husband gradually worked through his anger toward acceptance that we couldn't change what happened to Anna. We could only control how we moved forward and how we protected Sophie from further harm. He started sleeping better and stopped checking the news obsessively for updates about the Lanes case. 3 months after the indictment, Lysandra called with unexpected news. The Lanes attorney had contacted her with a plea bargain offer. They would plead guilty to reduced charges and accept termination of parental rights to Sophie in exchange for probation instead of prison time. The DA was willing to accept this deal to avoid a difficult trial that might generate sympathy for the Lanes. Lysandra said the offer was on the table for 1 week, and we needed to decide whether to support it. My husband's first reaction was anger because he wanted to see them go to prison. I understood his feelings, but I also thought about what this would mean for Sophie. A trial would take weeks and involve testimony about Anna's death that might become public. With a plea deal, everything would be resolved quickly and quietly. We met with Lysandra at her office to discuss the pros and cons of accepting the plea bargain. She explained that this was actually the best possible outcome for our family. The Lanes would have criminal records that would follow them forever. We'd have sole legal custody with their parental rights permanently terminated. Sophie could begin truly healing without the threat of a trial hanging over us. The only downside was that the Lanes wouldn't serve prison time, but Lysandra said prison sentences in these cases were often short anyway, due to their lack of criminal history. My husband asked if we'd look weak by agreeing to the deal, and Lysandra said no. We'd look like parents who prioritize their daughter's well-being over revenge. We talked for over an hour and finally agreed to support the plea deal. I called Roland afterward, and he said he'd inform the DA of our position. The plea hearing took place 2 weeks later at the county courthouse. I decided to attend because I needed to see the Lanes accept responsibility for Anna's death. My husband stayed home with Sophie because we didn't want her anywhere near the courthouse. The courtroom was small and mostly empty except for the lawyers and court staff. The Lanes sat at the defense table with their attorney, and neither of them looked at me when I walked in. The judge asked if they understood they were pleading guilty to negligent homicide and child endangerment. Both of them said yes in quiet voices. Then the judge asked if Kira wanted to make a statement before sentencing. Kira stood up and read from a piece of paper in a shaking voice. She said she was sorry to us and to Sophie for everything that had happened. She said she knew she didn't deserve forgiveness, but hoped someday Sophie would understand they had loved her even though they never met. She said accepting termination of parental rights was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but she knew it was right. Edward remained silent and stone-faced throughout the entire hearing. The judge sentenced them both to 5 years probation and ordered them to continue mental health treatment. After the hearing, Lysandra filed the final custody paperwork with the family court. The judge reviewed everything and signed an order terminating the Lanes' parental rights and confirming us as Sophie's sole legal parents. Lysandra brought the signed order to our house that evening, and we all celebrated with ice cream. She explained that we now had the option to tell Sophie about the outcome or shield her from the details. My husband and I discussed it that night and decided Sophie deserved to know the resolution in age-appropriate terms. She'd been living with uncertainty for months and needed to know that everything was truly settled. We'd tell her the next day when we were all calm and could answer her questions properly. The next morning, we sat Sophie down at the kitchen table after breakfast and told her the court case was completely finished. She looked between us with wide eyes and asked what that meant exactly. I explained that the judge signed papers saying she's our daughter forever, and nothing can change that. Sophie's shoulders relaxed and she asked if the other people would try to take her away anymore. My husband said no. They agreed she should stay with us and they won't contact us again. She was quiet for a minute and then asked what happened to them and why they changed their minds. I told her they made some very serious mistakes that hurt people, and the court decided it was best for everyone if she stayed with our family. Sophie nodded slowly and said she felt relieved, but also kind of sad, and she didn't know why. My husband hugged her and said it's okay to have mixed feelings about complicated situations. She asked if she'd ever meet them, and I honestly said I didn't think so, but we'd always answer her questions about them. Sophie went upstairs to her room and I heard her close the door quietly. My husband and I looked at each other and knew she needed time to process everything on her own. 2 days later, Marcella came to our house for one final session with Sophie. They sat in the living room while my husband and I stayed in the kitchen, giving them privacy. I could hear Sophie's voice occasionally but couldn't make out the words. The session lasted almost an hour, and when they finished, Marcella came to talk to us while Sophie went back upstairs. Marcella said Sophie was processing her feelings well, but struggling with the idea that she has biological parents somewhere who she'll never know. Sophie told Marcella she was happy to stay with us, but felt weird knowing there were people out there related to her by blood. Marcella said she normalized those feelings and explained they might change as Sophie gets older, and that's completely fine. She also said Sophie expressed some curiosity about Anna and what she was like. Marcella suggested we keep communication open about both topics and not treat them as forbidden subjects. My husband asked if Sophie would be okay long-term, and Marcella said yes. Children are remarkably resilient when they have stable, loving homes. She recommended we check in with Sophie regularly and maybe do some family counseling in 6 months, just to make sure everyone was adjusting well. 6 months passed and Sophie seemed like a different kid. Her anxiety decreased so much that she stopped having the nightmares that plagued her during the custody battle. She slept through the night most nights and her appetite came back fully. Sometimes she'd ask questions about her biological parents out of nowhere, like wondering what they looked like or if they had the same interests as her. We answered honestly without going into the painful details about Anna's death. She also asked about the baby who got switched with her, and we'd talk about Anna in general terms, saying she would have been the same age and might have liked similar things. I always made sure to emphasize that our bond as a family wasn't weakened by biology, and that love built over 10 years was real and lasting. Sophie seemed to accept this and would usually move on to other topics pretty quickly. My husband noticed she was more confident at the school and making new friends easier than before. Her teacher said Sophie participated more in class and seemed happier overall. I found myself thinking about Anna constantly during those months. Late at night, I'd lie awake wondering what she looked like and what her personality was like. My husband and I talked several times about visiting her grave, but every time we got close to deciding, we'd back away from the idea. It felt too painful to face the reality of her death in such a concrete way. One Saturday afternoon, we were working in the backyard, and my husband suggested we plant a tree in Anna's memory instead. I loved the idea immediately because it felt like creating something living and growing, rather than focusing on death. We went to the nursery and picked out a young maple tree with bright green leaves. That evening, we dug a hole in the corner of the yard where it would get good sunlight. Sophie came outside and asked what we were doing. My husband told her we were planting a tree for her sister Anna, who she never got to meet. Sophie stood there watching us work and didn't say anything for a while. After we finished planting and watering the tree, she asked if she could help take care of it. We said of course, and the three of us stood there looking at the small tree together. A few weeks after we planted Anna's tree, Sophie surprised us at dinner by asking if she could write a letter to Anna. My husband and I exchanged glances, and I asked her what she wanted to say in the letter. Sophie said she wanted to tell Anna about her life, and what they might have done together if things were different. I felt tears starting but held them back and said that was a beautiful idea. That night, Sophie sat at the kitchen table with paper and colored pencils while we helped her write. She described her school and her friends and her favorite activities. She wrote about our family traditions and the trips we took together. She said she wished they could have been sisters who grew up together and played together. She drew pictures of our house and the backyard with Anna's tree. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and asked what we should do with it. My husband found a small wooden box in the garage and we placed the letter inside along with a photo of our family. The next day, we had a small ceremony under Anna's tree with just the three of us. We dug a hole near the roots and buried the box there. Sophie said a few words about hoping Anna was peaceful wherever she was. I added that we'd always remember her and keep her memory alive through the tree. My husband said Anna would have loved having Sophie as a sister. A year after we first found out about the hospital switch, our family felt completely different from it had during those awful months of uncertainty. Sophie understood her complicated origin story and had processed it in a healthy way that didn't define her entire identity. She knew she was switched at birth and had biological parents she'd never meet, but she felt secure in our love and commitment. The three of us had learned that family is something you build through years of daily care and not just something determined by genetic connection. We celebrated the anniversary quietly without making a big deal about it. Sophie seemed to barely remember the exact date, which told us she'd truly moved past the trauma. My husband and I felt grateful we'd fought so hard to keep our family together and made the right choices even when everything felt impossible. Around that same time, Lysandra called to tell us the Lanes had completed their probation successfully. She said they'd moved to another state to start over fresh somewhere new. Kira was apparently in intensive therapy working through her grief and guilt over Anna's death. Edward had found new employment and they were trying to rebuild their lives separately from the tragedy that defined them for so long. Lysandra asked if we wanted their contact information in case Sophie ever wanted to reach out when she was older. My husband and I discussed it and decided to keep the information in a safe place but not share it with Sophie unless she specifically asked when she was an adult. We didn't wish the Lanes harm or want them to suffer forever, but we felt relieved they were no longer part of our lives or any kind of threat to our family's stability. Their chapter in our story had closed and we could finally move forward completely. When Sophie started middle school that fall, she seemed to have fully integrated her origin story into her sense of self without letting it define who she was. She told a few close friends about being switched at birth, and they found it fascinating rather than weird or traumatic. One friend asked tons of questions about what it felt like to find out, and Sophie answered matter-of-factly without getting emotional. Her resilience amazed me and confirmed we'd made the right decisions throughout the entire crisis. She joined the school newspaper and wrote an essay about family that her teacher praised for its maturity. Sophie was thriving in ways that seemed impossible during those dark months of the custody battle. My husband and I decided to renew our wedding vows on our anniversary that year. We'd been married 15 years and wanted to mark the occasion in a meaningful way that included Sophie. We planned a small ceremony in our backyard under Anna's tree, which had grown taller and fuller over the past year. We invited just our closest family members and a few friends. During the ceremony, we exchanged promises not just to each other but to Sophie as well. My husband promised to always be her dad regardless of biology and to support her through every challenge life brought. I promised to love her unconditionally and help her grow into the person she was meant to be. Then Sophie read a poem she'd written herself about how love is stronger than DNA and family is built through shared experiences, not shared genetics. Everyone was crying by the time she finished, and I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for our family and everything we'd survived together. After the ceremony, we had cake and Sophie ran around playing with her cousins like any normal happy kid. I started volunteering with a support organization for families affected by hospital errors and switched at birth situations a few months after our vow renewal. Sharing our experience with other families going through similar crises helped give meaning to everything we'd endured. I talked to parents who were just discovering switches and helped them navigate the emotional and legal complexities. Some situations involved families who wanted to maintain relationships with both children, while others were more contentious like ours had been. My husband joined me in advocacy work focused on improving hospital identification procedures to prevent future switches. We testified at state legislative hearings about the need for better protocols and tracking systems. The work felt important and helped us channel our anger and grief into something constructive that might protect other families from going through what we experienced. Sophie came home from the school one afternoon about 6 months after our vow renewal and asked if she could do her 8th grade personal narrative project about being switched at birth. My husband and I sat down with her at the kitchen table to talk through what she felt comfortable sharing publicly. She explained that she wanted to write about how family bonds matter more than biology and how love can overcome really hard situations. We asked if she was sure she wanted classmates knowing such personal details about our family, and she said yes, that maybe it would help other kids who felt different or had complicated family stories. She spent 2 weeks working on the essay and showed us drafts as she refined her message about chosen family versus biological connection. Her teacher called me after reading the final version and said Sophie's maturity in handling such a complex topic was remarkable for someone her age. The essay earned top marks, and Sophie presented it to her class with confidence that made me incredibly proud. 2 years had passed since that horrible meeting at the diner when we learned about Anna's death and the Lanes' custody demand. Our family had survived something that could have destroyed us, but instead we came out stronger and more connected. Sophie was thriving in the school with good friends and healthy relationships. My husband and I had processed our grief over Anna through continued counseling and found peace with loving a daughter we never got to meet. The legal paperwork sat in our filing cabinet as proof that no one could ever threaten our family again. We built a life that acknowledged our complicated history without letting it define our future. Sophie knew her origin story and had integrated it into her identity in healthy ways. Life handed us an impossible situation with loss and legal battles and grief, but we found our way through to the other side together. And that's today's wrap-up. I like when stories carry something you can actually take with you. If this one did that, I'm glad you stuck around.